It's now to talk about all this, the political risk in the markets. Tobin Marcus, head of policy and politics for Wolfe Research. And looking at some of your comments, Tobin, and it had to be before that meeting yesterday. So that meeting is, for example, you said that the odds are increasing for a shutdown and things aren't looking good. Then this morning, shutdown risks receding. Washington Post, deal in sight to avert closure. So you must have been surprised at the progress that was made at the White House yesterday.
So look, I mean, we never thought that there was going to be a long shutdown. The possibility that we were watching for coming into the week was, do we get a very short-term funding lapse over the weekend, maybe into early next week, as they get over the finish line on these bills? I think Johnson had already made it quite clear in the last few go-rounds of this that he thinks shutdowns are not good for Republicans politically, that he does not have a lot of appetite for doing sort of big knockdown, drag-out fight. So, you know, it seems like he is now probably on track to going ahead and getting things actually done before the deadline. But it's still not a foregone conclusion. You know, I could see this leak into the weekend. I don't know that the situation has changed that much. But in either case, I think the risk of a shutdown that makes any difference to markets, like, remains low, has always been low. This was a kind of a question of, can they color all the way inside the lines, or do they run a little bit over time?
Well, when you hear about one of the sticking points is the minutia and exactly how much to spend on the special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children. That was like a major problem because I guess $7 billion's already been earmarked, or $6 billion's been earmarked. They want another $7 billion. I don't know how how do these things, you know, not being there, watching the sausage get made, Tobin, how do these things finally come to how do they ever come to an agreement?
Yeah, that issue, the nutrition assistance issue, I think is one of the last things that is actually a dollars and cents negotiation that matters between the two sides. The rest of the sticking points, as you mentioned before, are more a set of conservative policy writers around abortion access, around gun rights vis-a-vis veterans. And on those, you know, those have been the main sticking points throughout the latter stages of this process. And the question is just, at what point does Johnson turn to his right wing and say, sorry, we're coming up empty on this stuff that you guys have wanted to do for months and months and months? It's always been inevitable that that stuff would not make it into the bill. And it's just a process of coming to grips with reality. So, you know, it's less like a real negotiation than you might think. In some of those cases, they're talking about this stuff a lot. But the biggest decision points on most of these issues are inside the House Republican caucus. When does Johnson actually turn to his right flank and say, sorry, it's time to move on, fund the government at these levels we agreed to months ago, and move on to other business? Well,
then we're back to the real world, and we're back to Ukraine, the border, in Israel. And the right flank is still there. It's I mean, Ukraine is just on everyone's lips at this point, and you know some of the anecdotal evidence we hear coming from there about, you know, no bullets, no ammo, it's pretty dire. The pressure's increasing on Mike Johnson, but how does that work with the aforementioned right flank, or the people that don't want to do it?
Right. It's a very similar dynamic where if he put the supplemental defense funding bill with Ukraine, Israel, Indo-Pacific funding on the House floor, it would pass easily. So it's just a question of his intra-Republican caucus politics. Like, when is he willing, you know, if he is willing, to go ahead and allow a vote on this thing? You know, but for the substantive importance of doing this, I think his political incentive to keep ducking it is pretty clear. It's a tough vote for House Republicans. Even people who broadly are supportive, I think, don't necessarily want to have to go on the record and vote for it up or down. So, you know, he's been dragging his feet on it, and I think he'll continue to do so. I mean, that's going to drag into late March at the earliest, the way that they've set this up. I think that's something that they'd be hoping to deal with around March 22nd, if not longer. You know, everyone else at that meeting yesterday, other than Johnson, was putting as much pressure on him as they possibly could. But he's remained non-committal. I mean, he still said yesterday this is not a priority. He's just trying to get these government funding bills through. So, you know, from his perspective, the game here is keeping the lights on. Some of these issues like Ukraine funding, again, despite how dire the anecdotal reports from the front lines are not, you know, I think he's not indicated that he's ready to move.
Right. And both sides are grasping at the border political football. And both sides are painting a narrative, you know, that would benefit them, all leading up to the November election. And so I don't know how that gets done. But with the Ukraine, Tobin, I mean, I can see some of these guys and gals are philosophically opposed to not knowing where the money's going. But are there some that really want to eventually do it, but they're just dragging their feet a little bit? Because it makes it, if they really think it's a good thing to do, that we need to do it, just dragging your feet to make a political point is like kind of like Nero, isn't it? Fiddling while Rome burns. It's if you really eventually want to do it, you can't F around forever.
Right.
I mean, if you want it to succeed.
Yeah. So there's an old saw in Congress, sort of hope yes, vote no. And I think that's where a lot of House Republicans are. Like, it is a divisive issue in the Republican Party. There are plenty of people who would be happy for aid to pass, but who do not want to have to vote for aid. And, if Johnson does put it on the floor, it's going to pass with many more Democratic votes than Republican votes. So, I think it's less a strategy of like, we're waiting until some future time when it's going to work better, and more everyone just kind of looking at their own political incentives, with the threat to most members of Congress coming more from primaries than from the general electorate, and saying like, it's a really tough vote. I'd just rather not have to take. And I think many of them are hoping that Johnson eventually will decide that he's willing to brave the backlash from the right, put it on the floor, let it pass with more Democratic votes than Republican votes. They personally can vote against it and say whatever they want to say, but ultimately be relieved that it got done.